50 years ago, February 1972. President Nixon's historic visit to China. A week that changed the world. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and welcome to a special edition of The Heat. It's now 50 years since former U.S. President Richard Nixon made his historic visit to China in February 1972. He was welcomed to Beijing by Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, and Nixon also met with Chairman Mao Zedong. The high-stakes engagement would lead to the U.S. and China establishing full diplomatic relations in 1979. And despite current challenges to the China-U.S. relationship, the impact of the momentous week still resonates today. We begin with this report by CGTN White House correspondent Nathan King.
Premier Zhou Enlai, on behalf of the government of the People's Republic of China, has extended an invitation to President Nixon to visit China.
It was a presidential announcement that surprised everyone. In late 1971, President Richard Nixon, the conservative anti-communist, went live on television and declared he would travel to China to seek peace and mutual recognition. But behind the scenes, there had been 2 years of preparations. Then, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger had met with Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, using a trip to Pakistan as a cover to travel to China. The US increasingly bogged down in Vietnam and wanting more leverage against the Soviet Union, saw potential détente with Beijing as a possible solution. China wanted diplomatic recognition from Washington, which withheld it after the end of the Chinese Civil War and the founding of the People's Republic in 1949. Beijing also considered engagement as a way to limit the impact of US containment strategies in the Asia-Pacific. In words that still resonate today, President Nixon's speech on departing for China summed up the purpose of the historic visit.
What we must do is to find a way to see that we can have differences without being enemies in war.
From the first handshake with Premier Zhou, things moved quickly and perhaps more smoothly than both sides may have expected. Within hours of landing, Nixon was called to see Chairman Mao, and their 65-minute freewheeling discussions touched on history, philosophy, and the problems of the Cold War in Asia. The US delegation were then plunged into a whirlwind of talks, banquets, and hospitality, with visits to many Chinese cultural sites, including the historic visit to the Great Wall, where impromptu remarks by President Nixon about the greatness of Chinese civilization warmed the hearts of over 860 million people.
I think that you would have to conclude that this is a great wall and that it had to be built by a great people, and a people who have this kind of a past must also have a great future.
The negotiations were full and frank, as they say in diplomatic circles. 9 meetings in 6 days. The result was the Shanghai Communique, a list of areas of agreement but also disagreements. Ensuring that both nations would not seek to dominate the Asia-Pacific, the communique also affirmed the One China principle and the US commitment to draw down forces in Taiwan.
That communique will make headlines around the world tomorrow.
It also committed to withdrawing troops from Vietnam. But perhaps most importantly, it was a commitment of how the US and the People's Republic would treat each other in the future, with mutual respect, the principle of non-interference, and respect for sovereignty. A hotline between the two nations was also established for the first time. The cultural aspects of this visit were also highly important. 50 years on, archival film of the meeting showed President Nixon truly charmed by what he saw in China. First Lady Pat Nixon too. Millions of Americans saw these scenes. And while formal diplomatic recognition would have to wait until the end of the decade under a new U.S. president and Chinese leader, it was, as Nixon himself said, the week that changed the world. Nathan King, CGTN, Washington.
Coming up, we will bring you major interviews with key players who were directly involved in President Nixon's visit to China in 1972. Plus, we will hear from former United States Ambassador to China, Max Baucus. And we will also get a Chinese perspective on the week that changed the world. We begin with Winston Lord. He was Special Assistant to former National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, and he later served as U.S. Ambassador to China. My colleague Mike Walter talked with him recently.
All right, Ambassador Lord, thank you so much for joining us. It's really an honor to talk to you. You've worked with so many presidents over the years, and yet you have deep admiration for the mind of Richard Nixon when it comes to foreign policy. Talk to us about his approach to China and Henry Kissinger's, because they did want to advance relations with China, but they each had a different perspective on this.
Both Nixon and Kissinger, when they came into office, wanted to open up with China after 22 years of mutual estrangement. Nixon's original impulse was a more stable world order. He had written an article in a magazine 2 years before he took office saying that he felt that leaving China with its 1/5 of the world's population outside the system was unstable. Kissinger equally wanted to open. His original impulse was balance of power. Namely, he felt that if we opened with China, we could have a better relationship with the Soviet Union by getting their attention, given their tensions with China. But both of these original impulses melded together so that both Nixon and Kissinger had these multiple purposes as they got into office and laid out their plans. The overarching objectives of the United States side for the opening were the following. First, to open up with 1/5 of the world's people. Secondly, greater stability in Asia. Thirdly, try to influence the Soviet policy to be more cooperative with us. Fourthly, get some help in ending the Vietnam War. Fifthly, showing the world that we could act boldly on the world stage despite the Vietnam War and our domestic problems. And finally, lifting the morale of the American people, which had been fatigued and polarized, a very difficult decade, including assassinations and domestic riots and so on.
So, Ambassador, it's not often I get a chance to talk to someone who's witnessed history, but also participated in actually crafting history. And you were kind enough to provide some pictures, and one of them is this banquet at the guest house the first night. And we see you sitting there, part of the U.S. delegation, the Chinese delegation there as well. And I want to actually get inside the head of Ambassador Lord on that day. I mean, obviously, this is such a huge event. What was going through your mind that night, you know, about that day, or were you just kind of still in the moment?
This was back in July 1971 when Kissinger and I and 2 other Americans went into China secretly to see whether a presidential visit would make sense for both sides. And for me personally, of course, it was especially dramatic. As a young person, being on this historic mission, flying in a Pakistani plane secretly to Beijing, in which you had the second highest mountain in the world, K2, outside our window as the dawn broke. We knew we were going to unleash a geopolitical revolution in terms of world politics. There was the James Bond secrecy aspect. And finally, for me personally, there was the fact that my wife was born in Shanghai and I was returning to the scene of her birth. So this was a very dramatic moment, of course, on many levels. When we arrived, we had a banquet that night with Zhou Enlai and Kissinger, a very small banquet. And so the feeling was quite dramatic. On the one hand, we weren't sure how this would work out. We had been enemies for 22 years, fought each other in Korea. And that's why we went secretly, to make sure that a trip for the president would make sense. But by then, we sort of had the feeling it would work out. We were met at the airport by Marshal Ye Jingying, who was on the Long March, Huang, the future foreign minister of China. So they were sending signals that they would welcome us, but difficult and arduous talks lay ahead, and we had 17 hours of talks with Zhou Enlai, his lieutenants, over the next 2 days, in which we did agree that a presidential trip made sense.
You also provided us a picture of you shaking hands with Mao. And, you know, I just want to get your thoughts about this, because obviously he's a huge historical figure. I mean, here you are, you're shaking hands with him. You're a young man at the time. What's going through your mind in this picture?
Well, first, I have to give you the context. When the president arrived in China, February 22nd, 1972, within an hour of our time in the guest house, Premier Zhou Enlai came back and said that the Chairman Mao wanted to meet with the president. This was very unusual. He usually would meet at the end of a visit, but it was a very positive sign, because by showing up so soon with the president, he was putting his stamp of approval on this courageous and visionary move by both sides. Nixon asked Kissinger to go, and Kissinger in turn asked me to go, because I'd been in charge of the president's briefing books. I'd been on the previous secret trip and the other trip. And so I was very excited, and I can talk about the meeting later. But when the meeting concluded after an hour, Nixon turned to Zhou Enlai and said, "Please erase Mr. Lord from the meeting. He was never here." So I was taken out of the photographs and the communique, and nobody in the world thought anybody was in the meeting on the American side besides Nixon and Kissinger, except for my wife, who I told and I could trust to keep a secret. So it was quite dramatic to be at this meeting. And a year later, on a subsequent trip, Zhou Enlai gave me this photo to prove that I actually was in the meeting. Now, the meeting itself, of course, was of momentous importance. One could argue that it was one of the most important meetings in the last half of the 20th century. It underlined a new opening for both sides. Mao exhibited great willpower, even though he was already quite sick. But he had a different style than Premier Zhou, who liked to expound in elegant sentences, charismatic Mandarin, laying out Chinese positions and philosophic and historical observations, whereas Mao spoke in brushstrokes, just a few sentences here and there, seemingly randomly going from one subject to another, but not getting in any depth into substance, leaving that to Premier Zhou. So we were a little puzzled. He was using humor, he was self-deprecating, he was using metaphors, and we weren't used to this, but we realized over the coming days as we negotiated and talked to Zhou Enlai and the others, that Mao had really sort of struck an overture for a symphony, and that Zhou could take these random, supposedly, sentences and use them as the structure for laying out the Chinese position. So it was a dramatic meeting, and it was an unusual one.
Fascinating. And then we have another picture that you provided us where you see both sides sitting, obviously having talks. You have Nixon and then Kissinger, and then you're next to Kissinger. And if you look closely at this picture, you can see that you've got a pen and paper and you're jotting down notes. And I can't think of a more enormous task. You know, here you are tasked with kind of keeping notes on this. What was that like being there, and what was your role, and what was the pressure like?
Well, I had sort of two roles. First, I was special assistant to Kissinger, and I was the one person that he involved in all his major initiatives. Not only the opening of China, but negotiations with the Soviet Union, secret negotiations with the North Vietnamese to try to end the war, and later on the Middle East shuttles. He wanted someone with a global perspective like himself on how all the pieces fit together. So I had had experience as a note taker in many meetings with many countries, and it was okay as long as you had translation so you could catch up. But Kissinger insisted on absolutely verbatim notes, including all his jokes. So it was a challenge. I had the broader challenge, of course, of helping him write memos, get ready for the trips, and write reports after the trips. And indeed, for the president's trip, I was in charge of his briefing books. And I had a lot of note-taking, including in China. I was in every meeting that Presidents Nixon and Ford and Kissinger had with Mao 5 times, Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping in the 1970s. So I got used to taking a lot of notes as well as being in very dramatic meetings.
How exhausting was all of this? Because I imagine they were long days, and then probably you had to debrief or kind of strategize for the next round of talks. I mean, they were long days, I would suspect.
They were long days, but of course, number one, I was in my very early 30s, so I had lots of energy. Secondly, the pure excitement and the importance and the adrenaline of what was taking place meant you could go for days with very little sleep. And it was, of course, a great privilege as well as a challenge to be involved in this.
Can you describe what these meetings were like?
In the Zhou Enlai Kissinger meetings, as well as Nixon, but in the Kissinger meetings, they would also go beyond their agenda. They both wanted to talk and were very interested in talking about history, culture, and philosophy. I'll give you one example. In one of the Kissinger-Zhou Enlai meetings, Kissinger asked Zhou Enlai, what do you think the impact of the French Revolution was? And of course, Kissinger was talking to the 1780s. And Zhou Enlai came back very straightforwardly and seriously said, it's too early to tell. So he was making the point that China had thousands of years of history and we were a young nation. So that was an example of the humor and the banter between them, as well as the wide-ranging geopolitical and bilateral talks that they had.
Yeah, you said in a conversation at Brookings that nothing could match the Zhou-Kissinger conversations. They were historical in every way. That's looking back now with several years being involved as a diplomat and stuff. But at the time, did you recognize it then that, geez, this is just truly amazing what I'm witnessing here?
Absolutely, you could tell. I mean, I've been in many meetings with other leaders, and I, of course, been in many meetings with Kissinger and the president, but these were special. Now, I don't want to leave any illusions here. Both sides were firmly defending their interests. And even though there was tremendous rapport and chemistry and a mutual respect, both sides were very strong in making sure that their national interests were pursued. But what was important is that both sides also tried to see what the other side needed. For example, I talked about the American reasons for opening. That China had 2 main reasons. One was to balance off the Soviet threat on their borders, and secondly, to break out of their diplomatic isolation. China was still in the Cultural Revolution. And both sides ended up achieving their goals and their objectives. In the classic Chinese parlance, it was a win-win situation. So what I thought was particularly unique was not only the fact that they both could articulate their position so well, but they could see the other side's bottom lines and their real needs, and they could encase all this in historic and philosophic context going back hundreds of years, or in the case of the Chinese, thousands of years. So all this made for a very rich as well as a very historically monumental series of exchanges.
Ambassador, true delight. Thank you so much for visiting with us.
Fascinating insights. And now we will hear from another man who played an important role during President Nixon's historic visit to China in 1972. Freeman, who would go on to be a career diplomat and ambassador for the United States, was the principal American interpreter during the visit. He shared some cherished memories with me when I talked with him recently. Ambassador, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
This was a historic visit by President Nixon to China in 1972. In fact, later he would refer to it as the week that changed the world. Now, at that time, you were a young man working in the United States Foreign Service. You were are fluent in Mandarin. Can you tell us how you were chosen to go on this historic trip?
Well, I had been trained to be the interpreter at the Warsaw talks, which were ambassadorial level talks between the 2 estranged countries, China and the United States. And I was suddenly hauled back to Washington from my language training in Taiwan and set to writing papers for a supposedly unknown purpose. But I'd read the texts of the Warsaw talks, so I wasn't surprised when President Nixon on July 15, 1971 announced that Henry Kissinger had visited Beijing and that he planned to visit it himself. Just before the trip, I was locked up in the operations center at the Department of State writing papers for the president. I'm told I wrote almost half of his briefing book, but I had no idea that I was going on the trip. I found out when someone shoved baggage tags through the mail slot at my house in the Cleveland Park area of Washington. So off I went.
Now, once you got on the plane to China, what was the mood like on the plane? I mean, was there a lot of concern on how this trip would go and what kind of expectations they had?
Well, there are different groups going with the president. Of course, his immediate entourage, his political advisors, and his spin doctors were greatly concerned about how this visit would play in American politics. It was a great gamble. No one knew whether this would help or hurt the president in his campaign for re-election. Those of us on the professional diplomatic side were uncertain, despite the fact that most of the communique had already been negotiated. We were quite uncertain how the diplomacy of this thing would work. I mean, after all, this was the President of the United States boldly visiting the capital of a government that we did not recognize. We recognized a different Chinese government in Taipei. And so this was really unprecedented.
I want to get to the significance of the visit in a moment, but as you reflect on some of the key moments, you were the principal interpreter for President Nixon. What are the memories that stand out for you?
A very impressive moment. And I remember in my own case, most of the interpreting I did was for the Secretary of State and his opposite number, Chi Peng-fei, the acting foreign minister. And our discussions were about all of the things that the United States and China disagreed about. The wars in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the Korean situation, the situation in Kashmir, and so forth. Meanwhile, the president, separately with Zhou and Enlai, was talking about the things we might cooperate on. And that, in fact, turned out to be the most important part of the Shanghai communique.
You mentioned Premier Zhou Enlai. In fact, you were at the banquet where you interpreted President Nixon's toast. You also had a conversation with Premier Zhou Enlai at that banquet. What was that like?
Most of the conversation with Zhou Enlai took place because the president didn't have much small talk, the sort of talk you have at a table. I ended up, I had gone down to the Wangfujing Xinhua Shudian, the new China bookstore, to buy what I had been told was a recent publication of the 24 dynastic histories. Zhou Enlai, of course, well informed about everything, mentioned this to me and asked me to explain to President Nixon what these histories were, which I did. Zhou Enlai then said, well, since you're so interested in these documents, these books, I will give a set of the 18th century version publication of them, the Bon Abelman, to the United States. Actually, he said he would give 2 copies, one to the State Department, one to the White House, which was a bit of a jab at the disconnect between the 2 organizations.
At that time, how conscious were you aware of how momentous this visit was? I mean, as I said earlier on, you know, President Nixon referred to it, or would refer to it, as the week that changed the world. Was he right? How groundbreaking was this trip?
He was right, but he was much more right than he knew. This was a week that changed the geopolitical arrangements in the world. China and the United States, which had had no substantive relationship, now developed one. This set in motion a process that none of us anticipated, and which culminated at the end of the decade in 1978 at the third plenum of the 11th Party Congress, when Deng Xiaoping opened a reform and opening process which depended on the relationship with the United States. And in the 1980s, 90s, and thereafter, China has continued to change at a remarkable pace. And one can trace this actually to the Nixon Mao Zedong meetings in 1972.
So the visit paved the way for the United States and China to normalize the relationship. Of course, that led to the visit by Deng Xiaoping to the United States. Do you think any of that could have happened without this visit?
Absolutely not. It was a tremendous gamble on both sides. There was opposition both in the United States from diehard anti-communists and in China from anti-American elements, including veterans of the Korean War. It was tense on both sides. It might not have worked, but it did work because both Nixon and Mao Zedong had a strategic vision that raised them above the ranks of ordinary politicians.
President Nixon spoke in China before departing, in Shanghai rather, before departing China. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
We are dedicated to the principle that we can build a new world, a world of peace, a world of justice, a world of independence for all nations. And if we succeed in working together where we can find common ground, if we can find the common ground on which we can both stand, where we can build the bridge between us and build the new world, generations in the years ahead will look back and thank us for this meeting that we have held in this past week.
So listening to President Nixon there, the tone that he was driving was respect for one another, listening to one another. How significant were those comments by the president to building this relationship?
Well, they were absolutely essential. The essence of diplomacy, which is the key element of statecraft, is empathy, understanding the feelings, the thinking of the person opposite you or your opponent, and reaching out to that person or opponent, which is what Nixon did. So the tone was entirely appropriate. It is sadly wanting today. We would do well to recall it and reprise it.
Today's China, of course, is very different from the one that President Nixon visited in 1972. It is now the world's second largest economy. It plays a major role in international affairs. How has the change in China's status impacted how the U.S. now engages with it?
Well, there's a total difference. In 1972, we were concerned about China's vulnerability. We were concerned about its weakness, its poverty, its isolation from the world. Today, American concerns center on China's strength, its prosperity, its competitive ability in the global economy. In 1972, the United States, in effect, extended protection to China. In 2022, that is inappropriate and unthinkable. So I think the circumstances are completely different.
You have been a diplomat at the highest levels of the State Department in the United States. What is your assessment of this kind of personal diplomacy that we saw in 1972? Do we need more of that?
I do believe, as President Nixon said in that farewell banquet in Shanghai, that listening to each other respectfully is terribly important to being able to address problems. I would say that in order to prepare for progress, one should remember the lesson of the 1972 visit, which was preceded by lower-level talks between Kissinger and Zhou Enlai, between others, including General Haig, who was Kissinger's deputy, and Xiao Guanhua and others on the Chinese side. So it was well prepared. I don't think we should lurch into summits without adequate preparation.
Ambassador Chas Freeman, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
We are going to take a quick break right now. When we come back, we will hear from former U.S. Ambassador to China, Max Baucus. And later, we will get a Chinese perspective on President Nixon's groundbreaking trip to China in February 1972. Stay with us.
I see a country on the move.
There's my opportunity.
Is it good to change so fast?
Yes, but it's a challenge.
We have one foot in the future.
But we never forget our past.
We need to talk to one another.
And listen.
More than 1 billion voices telling their stories. Rediscovering China, only on CGTN.
Modern vitality, born of ancient civilizations. Asia exemplifies diversity in its best sense and welcomes changes at the fastest pace. Asia Today brings you the headlines from the most populous continent, puts in focus politics, economies, and faces, and takes you on a tour of the sights from the region and beyond.
Welcome back to a special edition of The Heat as we look back at U.S. President Nixon's historic visit to China in 1972. Joining the discussion now is former U.S. Ambassador to China, Max Baucus. My colleague Mike Walter talked with him recently. He began by asking him for his recollections of the major diplomatic engagement 50 years ago.
It's a stunning visit, President Nixon's visit to China. At the time, to be honest, I was a bit focused on what I was doing in the state of Montana. But I've always had a deep interest in China because my political mentor was Mike Mansfield, who was Majority Leader of the United States Senate. He was in the Senate at the time. He's a Far East Asian history professor. And frankly, one of the most fascinating speeches I've read in my lifetime was by him. It was written in, I think, 1968. And it was, it's on an old typewriter and words crossed out in the old days before word processors. And it was basically why the United States should take a more positive view toward China. It was a long view he took. I know he spent some time with Dr. Kissinger. I know he spent some time with President Nixon. And I have a hunch that Mike Mansfield had a lot to do with Dr. Kissinger and President Nixon deciding that maybe made sense after all to go visit China and develop a relationship with China. Now, at the time, I knew Mansfield, and I was watching what he was doing with China, and I knew it was important. But the visit itself, I think, was more important than people realize. Although at the time, I don't know if the realization sank in as much as it should. Over time, we've realized just how important that was.
It's so interesting because I think people growing up today, I have kids and they're in their 30s, and to them, they've never known a time when there wasn't this relationship between the United States and China. But China must have been a mystery for a guy in Montana in 1972 and for a lot of your friends. So can you talk about how things have changed dramatically in that sense?
It's stunning. It's filled with revelations. It's filled with irony. It's incredible.
Back then, of course, the United States was fighting communists all over the world. The Cold War was pretty cold, pretty frigid. USSR, China, all those communists worldwide, and that was our focus. The world is very much bipolar. The United States and the countries under its umbrella, and basically at that point it was the Soviet Union and the countries under its umbrella. China was important at the time, but China was not nearly as important as economic and political power then as it is today. So it's just the economics have changed so much, but also the politics have changed so much, and it's whereas President Nixon really made probably the most important diplomatic visit in American history. We're now at a time when most Americans don't realize the immense positive political significance of that trip, and don't realize just how courageous it was. At the time, the U.S. was very anti-communism. It wasn't too long after McCarthyism reached its peak, but then collapsed. But we were very anti-China. In fact, President Eisenhower picked Nixon because Nixon was so anti-China. Because Nixon was so anti-communist. He hated it. That's how he campaigned. But once he got elected, he realized that, and I think with the influence of Dr. Kissinger, and also because Richard Nixon was a very smart man, that maybe it made sense to maybe drive a wedge between China and the former Soviet Union, at the same time open up trade. So it's an amazing development. And to contrast that with today, sure, we have immense bilateral trade between our two countries, upwards of $560 billion total two-way trade. But the political tension is much greater today than it was back then after the Nixon visit.
I want to go there with that, but just kind of dig a little deeper on the Nixon visit, because I think you said it was a courageous visit. It was also, whether you like Nixon or not, whatever party you're in, you have to look at it as this was really a bold step. And I think about today, do we have the capacity to have bold steps? Because now you've got a 24-hour news cycle, you've got social media, you've got the spinners and the leakers. Could something like this even happen today? And what have we lost as a result if we're not capable of doing that?
Well, you put your finger on a lot of the reasons why it's very, very difficult today for President Biden, for example, to undertake an action such as this. Nevertheless, I do think that if, say, President Biden or say President Xi were to undertake something approaching this, it would just undercut a lot of the, if not cynicism, a lot of the indifference is caused in the world today because of the internet, social media, and short-term thinking, short attention spans, and so forth. I think, and besides that, something like that, I think is worth trying. Don't forget, back then, this was, as you say, is a very bold move by President Nixon. Now, he didn't just decide one day to hop on a plane and go to Guam and to Shanghai and to Beijing. No, this was thought through. And Dr. Kissinger had several secret trips to talk to Premier Zhou Enlai. And when they thought through all the steps and all it needed to be attended to before finally deciding and announcing to the world, historic announcement, surprising announcement by President Nixon that he's going to go.
A lot of Sino-U.S. watchers kind of felt like when Biden was elected, he would tilt more towards your old boss, Obama, and have more of that sensible policy towards China. And yet a lot of people feel like he's kind of adapted to the Trump policies and really hasn't shifted that much. Are you surprised at that? Is he just boxed in within Washington? How do you see it?
I was a bit surprised, frankly. And I think the Chinese were surprised. I have many Chinese friends who would tell me, gee, I hope Joe Biden gets elected. And I go back to why? He said, well, if Biden's elected, that strengthens the hands of the reformers, not the hawks, but the reformers. And maybe we can deal better with the United States if Biden wins. Well, it hasn't turned out that way. Joe Biden, President Biden, is virtually as hawkish as President Trump, maybe more so in some respects. And I think, frankly, it's due almost entirely to domestic politics. Republicans and Democrats together in the Congress, Washington, D.C., nearly unified, anti-China, anti-China. It's very unfortunate, driven obviously by elective politics in America. 2022 congressional elections coming up, in presidential 2024, and nobody wants to be perceived, who's running for office, perceived as, quote, soft on China. It's unfortunate, but that's where we are. And I think it's a reflection of some of the tensions that arise during the concept of a potential Thucydides trap, because it's just those rising and established power.
But you recognize from your time there, and even prior to that, how this relationship, there are tensions, clearly, but there are benefits as well. And it seems like everyone kind of casts aside the benefits. And it seems like this carousel you're talking about, it's not every 4 years, it's every 2 years. How do you get off the carousel? How do you change the dynamic? How do you change the conversation?
I think that it's going to take a little while. I think the conversation will start to change and be a little more constructive and positive when both countries realize, and speaking now especially in the United States, that, hey, we've got to get along with each other. China's not going anywhere. The United States isn't going anywhere. That is, we're going to be here. So we got to figure out how we deal with each other. And and name calling doesn't work. Name calling makes things worse. When a country criticizes, we criticize China, us, and so forth. It's when we realize we have to find a way to deal with each other. Because after all, what leaders really care about is the well-being of their people. You know, Chinese people, American people, they really want the same thing. What's that? They want to have food on the table, decent jobs, take care of their kids, decent education for their kids, air and water pollution addressed, decent health care, let alone a little bit, pursue their dreams. I mean, it's not a lot, it's pretty similar, actually. And when we realize that the cultural differences should not get in the way of us trying to work things out. Sure, China is different. Sure, China is authoritarian. Sure, China has a certain view of, let's say, human rights. And sure, we Americans, we're a liberal democracy based on our Constitution and Declaration. We're just different. Now, Americans will always espouse human rights, human values. It's important, but have to recognize human rights are treated a little bit differently in different countries, and we shouldn't just jam American views down the throats of, in this case, China. We should work with other countries, express our points of view, and to defend our values. But we can't personalize our views and be critical of China or come across as arrogant or condescending toward China, just as China cannot toward us.
Ambassador, it was a delight. Thanks so much for your time.
You bet. Thank you. Thanks, Mike.
Nixon's visit to China helped lay the groundwork for a new relationship between Beijing and Washington. Join me now from Beijing is Victor Ga. He is chair professor at Soochow University. He has also served as an interpreter for Deng Xiaoping. With us too here in Washington, D.C. is Yukon Huang. He is senior fellow for the Carnegie Asia program. Welcome to both of you to the show. Victor Ga, take us back to China 1972. You were a young man then. How big an event was this in China at the time? What are your memories?
Well, before President Nixon's important groundbreaking state visit to China, China and the United States were viewing each other as enemies. And China condemned the United States as practicing imperialism. And therefore, the Nixon visit broke ice between the two countries and eventually paved the way for the normalization of relations between China and the United States in 1979. I think President Nixon's visit to China was one of the most important visits in human history because it changed the course of history and it opened the door to China and the United States. And the world has never been the same before the visit compared with after the visit.
Yukon Huang, we often hear the phrase win-win, but looking back, would it be fair to say at that time that visit and the way it opened up diplomatic relations between China and the United States, that was actually a win-win for both countries?
I think it certainly was the case, as Victor just mentioned. Nixon's motivations at that time was to establish a relationship, and he was looking very long-term, because at that time, no one could predict the course of development in China. He also had in mind issues concerning Russia and what was going on in Southeast Asia. Remember, at that time, there were tensions between Russia and the West, and there was growing tensions between Russia and China. And America was just sort of like coming out of the Vietnam War. So the question also was, what role could China play in restoring balance and more neutrality in the world? And I think in terms of this relationship being established, allowed for what I think more stable global situation for years to come.
Would you consider it, Yukon, an act of vision on the part of Richard Nixon in going to China at that time?
I think so. He was able to take a long-term view, not a narrow short-term view. That contrasts with the situation we have today, where in fact, from Washington perspective, most foreign policy experts really looking forward to the next election, and they tend to look at China in that context. That's part of the reasons why there's so much tensions. Nixon looked beyond that. He was credible in terms of opening up China because he was seen as anti-communist, and he needed someone like him to actually be willing to take the chance and to establish relationships and open up to China.
Victor Gao, as we just heard from Yukon, of course, the United States had its own strategic goals in reaching out to China, but why did China want to engage with the United States? I mean, were there any risks for China in doing this?
Well, I would say as far as the Chinese Communist Party was concerned, they wanted to have good, normal relations with the United States, dating all the way back to the Civil War in the latter part of the 1940s. However, at that time, the United States took the bet on the wrong party. They supported the nationalist and Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. And then after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, China-U.S. relations eventually broke off because of the Korean War. And then the two countries remained estranged throughout the 1950s and 60s. And throughout this time, China wanted to reach out to the United States to explore ways to normalize the relations. Fundamentally, I would say, Chairman Mao Zedong and Premier Zhou Enlai and their generation of leaders wanted to see that good relations be normalized and restored between the Chinese people and the American people. And they were audacious and courageous enough to accept the reaching out of the hand by President Nixon through Dr. Henry Kissinger in 1971, paving the way for the 1972 state visit by President Nixon. So I would say, from the Chinese perspective, American people should always be a friend rather than an enemy. And I think, in addition to this fundamental reason, the former Soviet Union was very much of a factor because at that time, China-Soviet relations were very much estranged, and getting the United States off from the enemy list and starting a normal relations definitely will be in China's own interest, in addition to seeking long-term relations of friendship and goodwill with the American people.
Yukon Huang, how key was this breakthrough in the 70s in setting the foundation for the relationship that we now see between China and the United States?
I think this was critical. Recognition of China, China then joining the global financial system, the World Bank, the IMF. Essentially, when Deng Xiaoping opened up China, it paved the way for 4 decades of very rapid growth. And a big issue being debated here in Washington, for example, is whether or not opening up to China was really in Washington's interest, given the tensions they are today. I think people forget the fact that China's rapid growth benefited the whole world. There are estimates which say that China's growth increased global growth by maybe a full percentage points, both in developed countries and developing countries. So the world was far better off with a more integrated China into the global economy. You know, when President McNamara visited China as the World Bank president in the late 70s, and he met Deng Xiaoping, Deng Xiaoping basically made the important comment. He said that China would develop with or without the West. But it could do so, it would do so much more rapidly with U.S. support. And I think Nixon launched that particular opportunity. And in that sense, everybody benefited.
Victor Gao, you know, the opening up on the part of China in the decades ahead, we saw what that has done for China, made it now the world's second largest economy. Do you believe that that would have happened regardless of this Nixon visit?
It will be much more difficult and much less likely. Why? Because back in 1972, China was very much locked up in its own huge box of ideology. China was firmly believing that whatever that was socialism should be good, whatever that is capitalism should be bad. And this debate in China lasted all the way until after Mao Zedong's passing away in 1976, and until Deng Xiaoping rose up as the paramount leader of China. I think for China and the United States to achieve a kind of rapprochement and reaching out to each other really enabled China to see the rest of the world in a more balanced and better way, because at that time China was extremely backward and poor compared with the United States. And there were many things that China could learn from the United States and learn from the rest of the Western world. So I would say this benefited China in tremendous amount of different ways, in terms of the outlook, in terms of the comparison, in terms of gaining confidence that only through development can China get rid of backwardness and move up the ladder of economic development and bring prosperity to the Chinese people. So I would say President Nixon's visit to China in 1972 served as a major catalyst of China's fundamental decision to move forward by opening up and re-engaging with the rest of the world.
Yukon, Huang, President Nixon, during that visit, he set a very different tone during the visit. It was a tone of respect. I mean, in addition to all the political meetings that the president held with the Chinese, there were other things as well. President Nixon and his wife, Pat, they visited the Great Wall. There were other events. 50 years later, are there still lessons to be learned from the kind of diplomacy that we saw at that time?
I think President Nixon really went all out to show to the American public that good relations with China would benefit both sides. There was very strong anti-China sentiments at that time. Today, 50 years later, there's also, what I'd say, relatively negative sentiments toward China. But what President Nixon foresaw was take a long-term view. It was the interest in both sides that had good relations. But the situation is quite different today. And the issue for the U.S. administration, again, is to take a much longer view about China. And it's a different China. So you go back, let's say, even 10 years ago, when Xi Jinping came into power. At that time, the discussion was whether or not America could accept what I call a new type of great power relations, because the China today is not the China 50 years ago. And I think the issue from a Washington side is what is the nature of that new kind of great power relations, and can it become benefit for both sides? And I think that's what's needed today, a much longer vision of the potential gains from stronger relationships, rather than trying to keep up these tensions that we've seen over the last few years.
Victor Gao, Nixon, of course, returned to China after he resigned the presidency here in the United States. In some respects, he's held in higher regard in China even now than he is in the United States. Does that surprise you, the irony of that?
Not really. I think from the Chinese perspective, the Chinese leaders and the Chinese people, the scholars, the educators, you name it, had always respected President Nixon for his wisdom, courage, audacity, and vision of steering away from the obstacles and paving the way for the normalization of relations between China and the United States. Because it would be extremely ironic if the Chinese people and the American people were always estranged from each other or hostile against each other. And I think in this respect, the Chinese people highly respect President Nixon's leadership role and statesmanship in re-engaging between China and the United States. Now, in the United States, I think President Nixon's reputation was burned by the Watergate scandal, but it was very much domestic. and China was very far away from the Watergate scandal, and we were not very much impressed by the ups and downs of that scandal. We focused very much on what President Nixon did in re-engaging China and the United States, and this is of truly historical consequence and importance because Nixon's visit to China back in 1972 changed the course of China's development and changed the whole world as a result of his important visit.
Yukon, as Victor says, the visit changed the world. It was one of the biggest events in history. In fact, at the time, that visit to China by Nixon was called the week that changed the world. Did it, in your view, change the world?
Well, it certainly opened the global economy, participation of China into the global economy, initially largely in the economic sense, and today even in a broader foreign policy political sense. And I think the world is no longer the same today as it was then. So we have two great powers, and I think the tension comes from the question of whether or not they can work together and make it a win-win situation. And 50 years ago, it was clearly seen as a win-win. Today, there's a concern in the West about whether China's rise may lead to what I call lower technological advancement or economic relationships. And I think in this sense, it's actually a bit misguided. A strong China, a strong United States is certainly beneficial to both sides.
Victor, very briefly, how did that week change the world?
Well, I would say President Nixon's visit to China in 1972 opened the door for China to get rid of the self-imposed isolation and re-engage not only with the United States, but with the rest of the world. You are talking about, at that time, about 1/4 of mankind, and now you are talking about 1/5 of the mankind, which will always be a very important factor on the global stage. And how to look at China, how to perceive China and engage with China will definitely have global consequences. And I would say the United States and China both benefited by opening up relations between these two countries. And I think we need to be eternally grateful to President Nixon's statesmanship and leadership, because we are talking about Chinese people and the American people. Despite of all the difficulties in the bilateral relations, I firmly believe the Chinese people and the American people will be wise enough to get along with each other rather than hurting each other. And we need to draw inspirations from President Nixon's statesmanship and audacity and steering a new course of action which will benefit both countries and both people.
Victor Gar, Yukon Huang, thanks to both of you for joining us. It has been a great hour of history and politics as we look back at Nixon's visit to China in 1972. 50 years on, it's still talked about as the week that changed the world. Thanks for joining us.
We are CGTN, China Global Television Network.